Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be talking about best practices for strengthening and getting the most hypertrophy gains out of your gluteus maximus muscle. Now, the gluteus maximus, which you can see right here in the image, this is the largest muscle by cross-sectional area in the human body. The butt muscle is supposed to be big. Unfortunately, we live in a society where people sit all the time, sitting disease. So in the past, people used to squat down. People had excellent mobility, and then some guy just said, you know what, I'm going to invent the chair. And then people started sitting in chairs, then from there probably came sofas, and it just gradually led us into a sedentary society where we have sitting disease. And I would blame that in part for why so many people come into the physical therapy clinic and they have weak glutes. There's a lot of PTs online that act like, oh yeah, low back pain is super complex. Knee pain, it's super complex. It's not all about strength. And it's like, do you know how many people come into the clinic and have weak glutes? It's embarrassing how many people have weak glutes. We need to fix this as a society. I can tell you that if somebody comes into the clinic with low back pain, there is probably a 99% chance that they have weak glutes. Another important thing to remember, just because somebody squats and deadlifts doesn't mean you can assume they have strong glutes. I have encountered many gym bros who squat and deadlift and their glutes are trash. It may not be the gluteus maximus, but definitely gluteus medius and minimus. Oh yeah, we got some significant strength deficits in those muscles. You can never assume anything is strong until you actually strength test it. Always keep that in mind. Just because somebody squats and deadlifts does not mean these glutes are strong. Glute weakness is a big problem in our society. Hopefully I beat that to death at this point. Pictured here is the right gluteus maximus muscle. Not only is it the largest muscle by cross-sectional area, and therefore the largest of the glutes, but it's also the most superficial of the gluteal muscles. You can see it has origins in part on the iliac crest, the sacrum, the coccyx, and not pictured here, the thoracolumbar fascia, where it has an indirect connection with the contralateral lat. Each glute kind of forms an X pattern as it goes over and connects via that fascial sling with the contralateral lat. What that essentially does is, let's say your left lat is contracted against resistance, then the right glute will fire even more strongly than it would in the absence of that contralateral lat contraction. And you can also do it vice versa. If the right glute is contracted, the left lat will have a more powerful contraction, etc., etc. Very interesting thing to keep in mind. And we'll look at actually examples of how you can apply that in a future video. But you can see there that the gluteus maximus is going to insert on the posterior aspect of the femur at a point called the gluteal tuberosity. It also has an attachment on the IT band. That's not just the tensor fasciae lata, also the gluteus maximus has an attachment on that. So when you have individuals with IT band syndrome, don't forget it's a good idea to really go after the gluteus maximus and strengthen that, not just the gluteus medius. Gluteus maximus also has an attachment on the IT band. Now, I'm not going to really be covering this in much detail in this video, but in open kinetic chain, one way to work the gluteus maximus is with a standing hip extension. And my recommendation would be to do these with a significant hip hinge to, one, increase the available range of motion that's utilized, but also to put a significant stretch on the glutes at the bottom. This is an exercise that I would say is pretty useful for beginners for building strength and size in their buttock, but as you become more advanced, I would recommend moving away from this type of exercise. You're just going to get a much bigger bang for your buck with closed kinetic chain type exercises. You're going to be able to load a lot more weight. These open kinetic chain exercises will run their course for most people fairly quickly. There's going to be much better exercises to target the glutes, and that's actually what we're going to look at right now. The first exercise we're going to be looking at for targeting the gluteus maximus is the deadlift. And there are two variations we're going to be looking at. The first you can see right here, this is the conventional deadlift. There are two scenarios where I would utilize the conventional deadlift. The first is kind of obvious. If you are a power lifter or some other type of sport and you're expected to be performing a deadlift in competition and your style is conventional, well then it behooves you to practice the conventional deadlift. The only way to get better at it is to actually do it. So if you do it in competition, you got to practice it. The second reason and this goes for anyone, is if you're trying to build a lot of just raw, absolute strength and power of the gluteus maximus right out of the hole, right off the floor going up to the top. The conventional deadlift starts with the bar on the floor. This might seem pretty trivial, but it'll become important in just a second. Bar starts on the floor, takes a lot of strength and power to get it off the floor and get it all the way up to the top. But then in a conventional deadlift, the emphasis is on the way up. It's not as much on the way down. I mean, certainly you can try to control the eccentric, but that's not the focus on a conventional deadlift. The main focus is getting it off the floor. So because you can just set the bar down on the ground as it comes down, you don't have to control that eccentric near as much. And so from a hypertrophy standpoint, yes, you can get some hypertrophy with the conventional, but it's probably not the most ideal from a hypertrophy standpoint. It might be from a strength standpoint, but from a hypertrophy standpoint, we want to actually utilize the Romanian deadlift, or RDL, which you can see right here in this video. So an RDL starts at the top. No matter how you do it, you have to control the eccentric down, and you never actually tap the bar, or really the plates on the side, to the floor. It's always in the air, and then you come back up. So it starts at the top, lower it down, and then come back up to the top. Because you have to control the eccentric, part of the contraction, this lift is probably a little bit better for hypertrophy than the conventional deadlift is. And in terms of biasing the glutes, the way that you do that is you allow the knees to bend a little bit more so that you really don't feel a strong hamstring stretch at the bottom. If you feel a really strong hamstring stretch at the bottom of the deadlift, it's more probable that you're doing a hamstring bias, and you should check your knee flexion angle. If the knees are closer to being straight and you feel a strong stretch in the hamstrings, it's probably more of a hamstring bias. So what you want to focus on doing is bending your knees a little bit more so that you don't feel that hamstring stretch, and that will mean that the glutes are going to be loaded pretty substantially. And the nice thing about the glute bias RDL is you get a really good stretch of the gluteus maximus at the bottom of the lift. You get a good stretch, control the eccentric, progressively overload, really good for hypertrophy, and don't think that you can't build a lot of strength with an RDL. Even though the conventional, in my opinion, is a little bit better for straight strength, you can still get a lot of strength gains in the glutes doing a Romanian deadlift. Exercise number 2, which you can see right here, this is a deficit sumo deadlift. This is a phenomenal exercise from a hypertrophy standpoint on the glutes, but it comes nowhere remotely close to isolation of the glutes. Yes, the glutes are heavily involved with the hip extension here. The adductors, or inner thigh muscles, are also heavily involved because we have such a wide stance. The quads even get some work here, not as much as, let's say, a lunge or a squat. But again, they are involved because the knees start with a little more knee flexion than we would have in a standard RDL or conventional deadlift. So doesn't come close to isolation. And for that reason, because the glutes have a lot of help here, probably not the best exercise for getting just raw strength gains in the glutes. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, at the very bottom here, you get a really strong stretch in the glutes. The reason you can see her standing on plates right here, which is the deficit, is because when you lower the bar down, you don't want the plates to ground out on the floor. You want to be able to utilize all the potential range of motion under control that you have. So that deficit allows us to get further into hip flexion at the bottom so the glutes get a bigger stretch. Now, in her case, she has much better inner thigh flexibility than I do. So when she descends down, it almost resembles more of a squat because she doesn't have to hinge quite as far at the hips to get such a degree of glute stretch at the bottom because the stance is wider. However, when I do this same lift, I don't have near that degree of inner thigh flexibility. So mine actually resembles more of a semi-sumo deadlift. And so I have to hinge a lot further at the hips there to get the same degree of stretch. But wherever your inner thigh flexibility is, you want to make sure that you're getting adequate hip flexion at the bottom to get those glutes a sufficient stretch. And for that reason, amazing exercise for hypertrophy here. Now, those last two exercises we just saw, those are both bilateral exercises. The left side and right side are working at the same time. So the gluteus maximus on both sides working really hard. The gluteus medius and minimus, which we'll be talking about more in the next video, They're working, but not near as much as we could work them in other exercises. To best work gluteus medius, we're going to need to do some type of unilateral or staggered stance exercise. And we're actually going to see two right here. We'll be going over gluteus medius and minimus in a lot more detail in the next video, but it suffices to say that whenever you're doing a glute exercise that's unilateral, staggered in some way, some kind of split stance, or even just totally single leg, that gets a lot more gluteus medius and minimus with the maximus, okay? But here the focus is maximus. Just understand these next two are going to get a little bit of medius and minimus as well. And exercise number 3 is a deficit reverse lunge. So when you're doing any kind of lunge or split squat, you want to make sure that to target the glutes, at the very bottom of the movement, you have a lot of hip bend, meaning a lot of hip flexion. Kind of as we've talked about in these other exercises, the more hip flexion or hip bend you get at the bottom, the more glute stretch you get. So that can be really good from a hypertrophy standpoint. If you have not very much hip bend, but you have a lot of knee bend, you're getting a lot more quadriceps. So one really good way to kind of figure out how to do this is to film yourself. If you film yourself and watch it back and you've got a ton of knee bend and not a lot of hip bend, it probably means that instead of stepping back this far, you need to step back even further. The farther you step back up to a point, the more hip bend you're going to get and the less knee bend you're going to get. And that's going to give you more glute bias. So the deficit, once again, allows us to get further into that hip flexion at the bottom on the working side. The deficit I'm using probably only needs to be about 2 to 4 inches. Any higher than that, and you start to transition the exercise into a step up, so it's a completely different exercise. Doesn't need to be that much of a deficit. 2 or 4 inches should do it for most people. This can be done as I'm doing, holding a dumbbell, and you can use one hand for balance as I'm doing. If you have really good balance, you can just throw a barbell on your back and do it that way. You can even use a Smith machine to take stability and balance out of the equation, and then you can load it up even more and get even more hypertrophy gains in those glutes. That being said, when you look at these exercises where the glutes are getting a really good stretch at the bottom, the glutes are strongest in their stretched position. So these exercises are fitting the strength curve of the glutes with the resistance profile of the exercise very, very well. And so that being said, they're highly optimum, and you can also get some pretty serious strength gains out of these, especially when you have less and less quad recruitment because you're minimizing the knee bend. Put more of it in the glutes, progressively overload, you can get some really strong glutes doing these types of exercises. But deficit reverse lunges, absolutely phenomenal for the glute max. And don't forget, because it's unilateral, we're also getting the other two, gluteus medius and minimus, to a pretty sizable extent. Exercise number 4, along the same lines, is that the Bulgarian split squat, particularly with a glute emphasis. So same idea here. You don't want a small step back. If you take a small step back and elevate your rear foot on that, you're going to get a lot more knee bend, not as much hip bend. That's going to be a quad bias Bulgarian split squat. So you need to have a bigger distance between your 2 feet. Your front foot, which is obviously the working side, the rear foot, which is elevated, you need a larger distance there, and you can see that in the clip here. I'm getting a lot of hip bend at the bottom, not as much knee bend. That is biasing the glutes. A lot of people will say, oh, you just need to hinge your torso forward. The hinging at the hip forward, so the torso being a little bit hinged, that is not the primary focus of a Bulgarian split squat. That torso leaning forward comes as a consequence of having such a large interfoot distance between the working side and the rear foot elevated side. When that distance is large, your torso has no choice but to hinge forward a little bit. But the stance width and the degree to which your hips bend versus your knees bend, that is what gives you the bias between quads and glutes. And I go over that in a lot more detail in our video on lunges and split squats. But Bulgarian split squats are phenomenal for glutes when you maximize that hip bend at the bottom. And if you really want to make Bulgarian split squats bad, you can do this setup right here, which is called a pendulum Bulgarian split squat. I go over this exercise solely by itself in another video and explain the benefits of it. But it suffices to say right now that this pendulum Bulgarian split squat, because your rear foot clears out of the way as you descend down, it allows you to get even greater degree of hip flexion at the bottom on the working side, and that means even greater stretch on that glute at the back. So I would make an argument here that, for other reasons that we discuss in that video as well, that the Pendulum Bulgarian split squat is even better than the standard one for glute hypertrophy. Definitely give that one a try. Those two exercises, because they are unilateral, again, get a lot of gluteus medius and minimus as well. Another great exercise to target the gluteus maximus is this one right here, exercise number 5. This is the hip sled. Not every gym is going to have this, but if yours does, wonderful. This is a fantastic exercise to blast your glutes. Now, it looks awfully similar to a leg press, but it is biomechanically very different than a leg press. 2 reasons. 1, it's designed to allow you to start the movement at the bottom with a lot of hip bend. There's going to be some knee bend, but a lot more hip bend at the bottom. And as we know, the more hip bend you have, the more glutes that are utilized in the movement. Second, the movement is designed to leverage the glutes very well, particularly in the bottom half of the range of motion. Now, remember, glutes are strongest in their lengthened position. So at the bottom of this movement, it's kind of the first half of the range. Quads are strongest at their shortened half of the range. So the more you get to a shortened position, the stronger the quads are. So realistically, if you push out all the way in this movement, the latter part of it is going to be a little bit more quads. So make sure those are warmed up first. But that first half or 2/3 of the range of motion, oh my gosh, you will feel your glutes working very hard. Get a good pump in those. I find this exercise is very good for hypertrophy of the glutes, in large part because at the bottom of the movement, where the glutes are in their most lengthened position, in their stretch, you also have the point of peak tension on them. So this absolutely wonderful for hitting the glutes. Now on to our final exercise, number 6. This is the hip thrust. I'm doing this on a machine right here, but it can also be done with a free barbell setup. Now, the hip thrust is biomechanically different than all the other glute exercises that we've talked about thus far. All of the others have this unique feature where if we look at the point in the movement where the muscle is at its most stretched, it's its most lengthened, that's the point in the movement where peak tension is on the gluteus maximus as well. So we're correlating the point of peak tension with peak stretch, essentially. And this is really good for optimizing that stretch-mediated hypertrophy that's so useful for a lot of bodybuilders and other individuals as well. But the hip thrust is the reverse. So in the hip thrust, at the bottom of the movement, when the hips are bent, and they're not even bent that much, only a small amount, that is theoretically where we're putting the glutes on a little bit of a stretch, but that is where the movement is the easiest and it has the least tension. When you come up to the top of the movement, the peak squeeze, where your hips are neutral, you essentially form that hip tabletop, that's where the glutes are shortened, and that's where the movement is the hardest. So when we're talking about a hip thrust, we can't justify glute growth from a stretch-mediated hypertrophy standpoint. You've got some people on one side of the argument that say that the hip thrust is terrible for hypertrophy, that the results can be very underwhelming. You've got other people that say it's great. I tend to think that in a lot of people, probably most people, it can be very good for hypertrophy, but it's not from a stretch-mediated perspective. It's because if you load a lot of weight on this, a lot of weight, it's going to take a lot more weight than something like a deficit reverse lunge, and you do it for a lot of repetitions, you can put a ton of mechanical tension through the gluteus maximus on this exercise. And it's that mechanical tension that drives hypertrophy, especially as you overload that over time. Now, that being said, the fact that you have to load a ton of weight on this to get the same stimulus for hypertrophy than you would on, let's say, a deficit reverse lunge, that is a disadvantage because it takes a long time to load those plates on and then also to take them off when you're done. It's kind of a pain in the butt, no pun intended there. But again, if you load a lot of weight and do a lot of repetitions, a lot of sets of this, it can be fantastic for hypertrophy. And I think that the proof is in the pudding. You see all sorts of girls over the gym with nice booties, and it's because, in large part, a lot of them do a lot of hip thrusts, and they load it up pretty good. Guys, we need to get on this. It's a really good exercise, but you have to load the weight. Now, on any given day that you're going to the gym to work glutes, by no means do you have to run through every single one of these. These are just options that you can cycle through in your journey to get bigger and stronger glutes. But hopefully it did give you some ideas of things that you can try if you haven't already. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.